Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in, and happy to share with you some of uh, the thoughts on, treating options and, honestly, a lot of the practical things I think are just starting to come to light because for those of you in the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, it has been a wonderful world of experimentation. I would say that you're going to get to hear from Dr. Rock. So I'm going to get us started. If you want to go ahead and advance the next slide, please, Shanna, that will be great. Great. So as Dr. Harris already alluded to, you know, there are numerous reasons why people traditionally have treated their water. And, I'm even going to kind of disengage a little bit from the produce safety rule and that being a corrective measure, just an operating procedure to meet the produce safety rule requirements, since clearly we're a little bit in flux there. But I would say in general, why do people want to treat their water? Well, when they're talking to those of us in the food safety realm, a lot of times they're worried about the microbial quality or fluxes in microbial quality at certain times of the year or after certain events. They're just trying to manage risk on their farm. A lot of people have been doing things for just normal operation of their equipment, and treating water to prevent clogging on emitters so that everything runs as it should be, so that you really get really efficient irrigation events, and that you have, of course, water getting to the place it needs to go and your infrastructure maintained. We've also seen, as alluded to in the Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, some buyer or marketing groups taking this role on as far as mandating water treatment under certain scenarios. And, there's even, beyond leafy greens, some other commodities which we're starting to see this pop up in that have potentially been historically tied to agricultural production water, associated with outbreak events. Again, you can also look at, okay, if I'm just doing an infrequent event like frost protection, then, that may also be something that I would want to treat that water, because especially, the closer the product gets to actual marketability. So I would say that at the end of the day, we too do not have a crystal ball and have no clue how this may or may not fit within the context of the produce safety rule, other than what was mentioned, as far as it in the rule as it was first issued, being a corrective measure and also a normal operating procedure that people could elect to implement on their operation. Next slide. Yep. So my real goal is to just tee off and to introduce to you all kind of when I'm thinking about water treatment, how I kind of divide things up. And that's really comes into what category does the treatment actually fit into. And so, just buckets, I call them chemicals, which are chemigation events versus devices. And these are really structured around the EPA. It is the agency, the federal agency, which is tied to evaluating their efficacy. With our chemicals is the one that we'll talk about first. They must be EPA registered for their use and be targeted under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act before they can be lawfully used. And so when we say labeled for intended use, it's just like any other pesticide, right? The label is the law. You have to stay within those labeled treatments. What we're traditionally seeing on labels for these compounds, let's say maybe they have a label for either preventing algae growth or other microbial growth in line, but they really do not have labels currently, and Shan's going to talk about that a lot more, around how do you control for foodborne pathogens, which is our goal when we're looking at this through a lens of food safety. Now, the other group is called a pesticide device. And these are different in the fact that they're actual physical treatments. And I would say that, they're still regulated by the EPA, but they do not require an EPA registration. So one big difference would be is that the facility who manufactures these would be registered with the EPA, but Unlike our labels that we see for these compounds that fall in the chemical category, they do not have that EPA registration number that we always look out for. Again, some states, depending upon where you're at, may require registration of pesticide devices. And so that may be something else that you have someone over managing that at the state level. For our ag water treatments, again, just examples of what falls into each of these categories. So an antimicrobial pesticide product is the long term for these chemical compounds that are going to be evaluated by the EPA. They are a substance or mixture that's intended to lessen the severity of a pest, as their kind of overarching definition by the EPA. The things that fall into this category that we're most commonly seeing used for pre-harvest water is chlorine. And chlorine can either be in liquid form, so a sodium hypochlorite, it can be in a gaseous form, or it can be in a solid, which is calcium hypochlorite. So there's a few different flavors of chlorine that we tend to see implemented. Proxycetic acid is also being, experimented with from my perspective, and a lot of people, for various reasons, looking at that as an option, as opposed to chlorine, which has historically been our kind of most inexpensive compound that falls in this group. Chlorine dioxide is also getting a little bit of evaluation with farmers and ranchers, but has some mixing requirements typically that does complicate application. For our antimicrobial pesticide devices, again, this is going to be a device that works by electricity, light, or physical mechanism. So some of these things are maybe, I think people kind of scratch their heads when we talk about them. The first one is UV light, and that's definitely amongst the devices, what we're seeing, in pre-harvest water treatment. Amongst these devices is probably the most commonly looked at, although I would say it's very much exploratory in nature at this point in time. Ozonation can also fall into this category, and you may be thinking, but ozone is a compound, but it's actually generated by a special instrument, and so it falls in this device category. And then we can also have physical barriers like filtration, and again, not just crude filtration, like a sand or disc filter, but actual filtration that would remove microorganisms of interest for us. There are a lot of things listed here. And honestly, this is what Shana's going to spend a lot of the time going through as far as things that we encourage growers and ranchers to think about when they are trying to select, if they're going down the path of treating pre-harvest water, what should they be thinking about? And I would say that it's not by order of importance or anything, but more of just a roadmap of what we encourage people to think through when they're trying to think what may be the best option for them. And they may arrive at a different answer depending upon the crop, the location, the infrastructure they have available, how that water is going to be used, the flow rate that they need to treat all at once. With some operations, with the volume of water they're using, it is like you're running your own little city, right? Basically, for trying to treat water. So it's not anything to be entered into lightly. The other things that we will touch on, that also should not be discounted, if you're the one running the operation, are things like crop sensitivity. You don't want to kill your crop even though it's really safe when it's dead out in the field. Worker protection standards, right? We're talking about pesticide products. They're all going to have labels that have to be followed and restricted entry potentially, although that's not traditionally what we've seen. And then also EPA and local environmental considerations. Any water that's returning back to a watershed for some of these compounds like chlorine, chlorine dioxide that have residuals that can remain in the water, there's many times going to be regulations overseeing maximum residuals left in that water. This is my last slide, and I'm going to hand off to Dr. Rock, but just to start down the road of, okay, what is this EPA? What does the EPA really oversee? Again, it's required for the compounds which fall into this pesticide products category. The things that, if I were in your shoes, I would start to look for would be that EPA registration number, and specifically instructions for treating irrigation water. We work with a lot of growers who are like, well, it's sodium hypochlorite, right? Aren't all sodium hypochlorites the same? And the answer is no, because if that manufacturer didn't seek out a label for treating irrigation water, then you're not supposed to use it, even though you can find a similar product, same active ingredient, same concentration that does have that label. Right now, there is no EPA approved chemical treatment of production agricultural water. However, what we have currently are a building library of scientific studies that may help set the limits for how rigorously you need to treat the water to control for foodborne pathogens or indicators like generic E. coli. Again, you have to, the cart has somewhat come before the horse, and this regularly happens when you're on the leading edge of something. But from our perspective now, you have to abide by the label, but we also want you to be treating in a way that actually achieves the goal of managing a food safety risk, if that's what if that's our goal, right? So with that being said, I think I'll let you take it over there and get into more of the nitty gritty details around EPA and some things that have recently occurred within the realm of product testing and evaluation.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Faith. So I'm going to go over a little bit about kind of the current status of the EPA joint FDA protocol for modifications of the label and kind of what we're seeing and hearing from industry related to that. So as Faith said, most all of the products that are currently registered for antimicrobials in irrigation water are not specifically labeled for human health pathogens or foodborne pathogens. And so there's been this recent discussion, or really discussion of need from industry saying, okay, if water treatment is going to be a corrective action, we want to, follow the law and follow these products according to their label, and we need a mechanism or a way to do that. So while my laboratory and others have been able to perform independent studies or be able to, have scientific data on efficacy against those foodborne pathogens, there's not ways that I, can change the label, or I can necessarily work with industry to do that. So recently, earlier in 2020, the FDA and the EPA announced a new protocol for the development and treatment of pre-harvest ag water. And we've put the link in here for you. It's not a super long document. There potentially could be some modifications to that, but at least now they've presented a path forward for chemical companies to work through basically an evaluation of efficacy against different human health pathogens. And so they're asking that products be evaluated against STEC, so Shiga toxigenic E. coli. There's a panel for E. coli. There's a panel for Salmonella, and then there's also a panel for Listeria. So EPA and FDA came up with these specific panels that can be purchased by certified laboratories. I think it's between 6 to 7 strains per panel. And the EPA FDA protocol also dictates a specific water quality, so a specific turbidity that has to be used for these evaluations. It also dictates 2 different pHs, so a pH range, and then 2 different temperatures. So again, and getting at a temperature range. And really, in discussions with the FDA and EPA about this protocol, they wanted to draft something that would be applicable across the country. So not necessarily just what we see occurring in the Southwest and those growing conditions, but much more broader than that. And so it kind of remains to be seen about how many chemical companies are buying into this, or who the first ones will be to try to go after this to modify their label. It's pretty expensive to do. We're talking, tens of thousands of dollars for a company to kind of go down this path to modify their label. But certainly, I think industry is pushing on this and sees a need for it so that they can now come into compliance. The other thing that I want to mention is that this specific acceptance criteria is dictating that each of these chemistries must demonstrate a minimum of 3 log reduction of each of those test organisms as compared to kind of their control, so their non-treated samples. And so we've raised some questions to EPA and FDA about, how they landed on 3 logs. Is that appropriate for these chemistries? Do we think they'll be able to meet a 3 log reduction with the application rates that we're currently seeing in industry? The other thing is that in the protocol, it specifically dictates a 1-minute contact time. And so, I challenge each of you, if you're a grower or someone who works with growers, to think about their irrigation system and their irrigation system and distribution system setup, and think about, how long it takes water to flow, from the intake and pump kind of through that distribution system. And in the drinking water and wastewater world, we often talk about a point of compliance, and that's where you must potentially meet a 3 log reduction. So what should be the most appropriate point of compliance for ag water, for a grower in a distribution system, if we're thinking about overhead application, for example, and is 1-minute contact time appropriate? So I think, we will see, what happens related to this, and we'll see kind of what industries are starting to step forward, or companies are starting to step forward. Here's another question that we often get about other registered antimicrobial products that may be labeled in use during post-harvest applications. So thinking about post-harvest fruit and vegetable washing. And so because these antimicrobial products are not labeled for their use in agricultural fields or at that pre-harvest setting, they cannot be used to treat irrigation water that's applied prior to harvest. So again, kind of we're at this new status, trying to figure out how to make this work, as Faith said, kind of the cart before the horse. But we'll see where this goes, and no, rest assured that there's plenty of us kind of pushing and pulling from EPA and FDA to kind of make sure that whatever is finalized is appropriate and feasible for the ag industry. So additionally, kind of finishing up and wrapping up about that status, that FDA does not have specific information on the current companies or pesticides that might be submitted to EPA for registration of their products and those specific organisms, as I discussed before. I think just us in our laboratory and working with industry, we've talked to 3 different companies that manufacture a variety of different chemistries that are currently used. And so we'll see which one kind of hits first. And so we'll keep you all in the loop as that progresses. So another big thing that we wanted to make sure that we wanted to touch on kind of outside of the chemical, potential chemical treatments are, the discussion related to EPA regulation of these pesticide devices. So, as Faith said, it's a different process through the EPA to make sure that these pesticide devices are not making false or misleading claims about their effectiveness. So a couple of things, like if you all are considering the use of a pesticide device, and I've got some examples of those in the next couple of slides, that company needs to have scientific data to support claims. Typically that looks like a manufacturer validation or a third-party validation of a system as it's been designed and put together. And then a manufacturer of a pesticide device is regulated and will have to have an EPA establishment number for that device itself. And so those are some of the questions that you all should be asking of these companies if they are trying to promote a pesticide device for use specifically. So here's some examples of some non-chemical treatment alternatives, some pesticide devices. These are for Ag Partners Southwest, so a local company here in the Southwest in Yuma. We've been working with them side by side to try to do some initial validation of their systems as alternatives to some of the chemical treatments. On the left-hand side is a larger UV unit, and that is really geared towards very large, production agriculture, 40-acre fields, many gallons per minute of water flushing through that system. The system on the right-hand side is much smaller, so smaller plots, 1 to 5 acre fields. So what we're starting to see is kind of this recent push to seek out alternative non-chemical pesticide devices that could potentially be used. I think some of the questions we're starting to see with increased use of water treatment or discussion about water treatment is from industry about, well, we know that we can maybe treat water, and we know that we can potentially, achieve that 3-log reduction for these human health pathogens, but what are the short, medium, and long-term impacts to soil health and to soil microbial communities, or even just salinity as one potential issue that can occur. So we're starting to see these questions being asked, and to see kind of this need for some of these pesticide devices also to be developed. So one of the discussion points I'd wanted to bring up today, obviously, Linda already put up that we're still waiting for FDA water compliance states, or still waiting on that extension, and that remains to be seen kind of what that looks like. I think we all kind of joked that we could probably come up with a better rule before FDA comes out with it on their own. But currently, under the PSR as it's currently stated, if you were treating your water, a grower would not necessarily have to create a new microbial water quality profile using those test results post-treatment. And so, I went ahead and I pulled out the language as it stands now. Now, this potentially could change, or likely will change. And I won't read all of this for you, but just point out that if you were to employ an agricultural water treatment system, it's up to you to decide the frequency of testing and what that looks like, and how you're going to be monitoring your treatment systems. And so Faith is going to discuss a little bit later in her section a bit later around validation and verification, and kind of what that looks like, and how you as a grower would define what those parameters are for your individual treatment system. But kind of as it stands now, the produce safety rule as written would not dictate that frequency, and how that testing would kind of fall out for that individual, either chemical or device that you might use. Now, some of the things that I'm going to go over now are kind of the practical constraints and considerations now that we've been doing ag water treatment work for the last couple years, and working with growers and trying to kind of think about these real life grower scenarios about water treatment, about what we know if they do any pH amendments, or if they do any fertigation. I think it was pretty surprising to FDA when they learned that, a grower, applies crop products through irrigation water, and they have to treat at the same time. And those might not always go hand in hand. And how do we handle that? As I spoke about earlier, we have to think about that contact time within the distribution system to achieve those treatment goals. And so depending upon the chemistry that you may select, or the treatment type that you may select, you may need some enhanced contact times to achieve those goals. So is your point of compliance that first sprinkler head? Is your point of compliance that last sprinkler head? And there's discussions and pros and cons to both of those. And then what we've been doing more recently is really talking to the folks that are boots on the ground, that are doing the water treatment. So we can design a beautiful system. We can, describe a specific chemistry and a dose, but then real world happens. What happens if you get a slug of sediment or turbidity that comes through your system? Or what if you have algae in a specific place? Or what if the temperature is really low or really high, and you're not getting your readings that you need. It's up to the boots on the ground person to do modifications and to do tweaking and to play with the system until they get it correct. Well, you also have to think about the water that's already in the distribution system and purging that out, what stabilization or looks like for your distribution system, how long you have to wait after some modification at the pump for restabilization, and then when you're re-verifying that residual that you're specifically looking for at that point of compliance. So, this was a 3-acre plot that we were playing around with in 2019, specifically related to ag water treatment. We were aiming for a 4 ppm residual out here at the end of the field. As you can see, we have a lot of pipe that's out. So extended pipe means that we have to purge more. It takes longer time for that residual to make it out there after we've made a change. So, what do we need to dose here? And then what will the residual be here? And so again, a lot of this is real world application with basically playing around with your system and getting it to a place that you feel confident, but recognizing that because you're out in the environment, conditions change, and that you can aim for perfection, but it's probably going to vary a bit. So here's some additional data. Now this is from a grower here locally that has set up some automated monitoring systems for different parameters. And so I'll just walk you through this. So along the bottom is date and time. So don't pay too much attention to that. We're just going to watch what happens to water quality over time. And so the green line is the pH. The teal line is the residual chlorine. And this specific grower was using a sulfur burner to help with pH amendment of the water to try to bring that water back down, try to neutralize some of that water so that he could be more effective at introduction of some of his fertilizers, and then also with water treatments. So if you're moving through from left to right, you see that red circle. So there's no chlorine dose, the sulfur burner is off. You can see kind of here in the middle here, where they turn their chlorinator on and it, bumps up, and then they're trying to manage that residual to kind of get it to where they'd like it to be. He was shooting for 2 to 3 residual of chlorine. They get to a place where they're happy, they've stabilized, they turn their sulfur burner on, and lo and behold, all that chlorine is gone. And that is consumed. So this is a real life scenario with a grower that is great data to show us that if you're using these things in conjunction with each other, that you might not always get the anticipated results that you would like to see. So again, many inputs are distributed in water, and that can impact efficacy, as we just saw. I've got some other examples. With fertilizers. And so in the next slide, I'll kind of go over 2 commonly used fertilizers with different treatment chemistries that we've evaluated in lab scale. And really, this was some initial work so that we could get a better understanding of those impacts between fertilizers and water treatment chemistries. And so it's really important that growers evaluate efficacy of their treatments when they're doing their on-farm validation studies and thinking about, well, how am I really going to implement a water treatment, and when am I going to implement that, and is that going to be at the same time that I'm going to be using some of these fertilizers. So on the left-hand side, we're showing interaction of PAA with commonly used nitrogen source CAN17 here on the left-hand side. And so we have log reduction of coliforms on the left, and as you can see, we're pretty flat. We reached our limit of detection, and you don't see a real impact of PAA with the CAN17 at both residuals of 6 ppm and then also 8 ppm. Alternatively, if we look over here at chlorine, and for chlorine, we are doing a residual of 2 ppm and then also 4 ppm, you see that lower concentration of chlorine is drastically impacted by that fertilizer, right? So we see a significant drop in log reduction of coliform bacteria with the inclusion of that CAN17 fertilizer in conjunction with that water treatment chemistry. So again, this is just one example. We're trying to broaden this out a bit more to also look at some organic fertilizers as well. So related to that, back to the same grower who's also, it's an organic grower working with fish emulsion. And so again, a real quick example, follow that teal bar. They've got their residual chlorine kind of bouncing around. Here they've got their application of fish emulsion, and then you see that drop, right? And then here's another application of fish emulsion, and you see that residual drop again. So really trying to get you all, either as growers or as folks who advise growers, to think about that interaction of some of those input products with your chemistries that you're selecting. So what does this tell us specifically for chlorine? Kind of regardless of the chemistry, we saw significant decrease in efficacy. For PAA, it was pretty negligible impact, and we're still investigating this a little bit further. So, as a grower, you might want to increase your dose or use an alternative treatment during fertigation, but that's not always an option, right? We just talked about impact on soil health. We're going to talk about impact on phytotoxicity. So you can't always just turn it up to kind of overcome that impact of some of those inputs. And so what we're talking about currently with industry is, well, what happens if you have to fertigate while you're treating? Potentially what you might see as a third party or a buyer or a customer request that you do some confirmatory testing to confirm that impact on generic E. coli or total coliform bacteria, or you might see raw product pre-harvest testing requirements for pathogens. And so those are some of the things that we're discussing with industry currently. So I also wanted to touch on briefly, before I wrap up, some additional considerations for successful implementation. So everyone comes to us and says, well, which treatment do I select? Which is the best one? And what we always tell them is that they will all work. It just depends on how much money and time you want to invest in that system, and if that system's kind of right for your crop type and your ranch. And so cost is a huge one, and not only the cost of the chemistry itself, but also the capital equipment costs and then ongoing operation and maintenance costs. So here in the picture on the right hand side, I have my AccuTab system that's sitting there, and right next to a UV system with a giant generator. So there's different inputs related to the different types of systems that you may want to deploy on your farm or ranch. And so while these AccuTab systems that are, calcium hypochlorite or, passive systems, you're not having to have electrical inputs or potentially glass in the field, things like that. They're going to be a whole lot more mobile, but they might be easier to test. So it just depends on kind of your water treatment goals, how much you're willing to invest in that, and kind of what that looks like over time. So we just ask industry to kind of think through some of these things. And for some places, we see growers really successful at some chemistries, and at other places deploying a completely different chemistry. So recognize that in some places, something may work well for you and not for others, and it might work well for different source water quality in a different location. So some of the things, again, I said that, most of these will work for you, but how do you select and evaluate kind of what you're going to be implementing in your farm or ranch? So some of the things to think about are obviously the volume of water. So how much irrigation water needs to be treated? What is the flow rate of your system? What is the discharge rate on your ranch? And how that's going to be impacted by the chemistry or device that you're going to use. The next thing that I mentioned earlier was that contact time. So obviously we know that in order for the microbe to be disinfected by that chemistry, for example, or say UV, if you're using UV, there's time that's needed to see that decline. And so thinking about your distribution system and what that looks like, and what potential chemistry you need to achieve that rate with that contact time that you have. Obviously, we brought up some examples of interactions with fertilizers and pesticides or other amendments or inputs that you're having. Thinking about that and thinking about how to collect samples after you do a fertigation to confirm that impact on your generic E. coli values and see what that looks like. And then lastly, worker safety and protection. I think that we do a ton of work trying to talk to food safety professionals and extension specialists and growers about water treatment. I don't think we do a good enough job talking to the people who are boots on the ground and those workers and some of those considerations. And so really trying to think through who are your folks who are actually going to be doing the work and how can they do that successfully, and what are they worried about related to some of these chemistries that we might be putting out there, that they might be exposed to. So I know a lot of that is scary, and I know a lot of this has been kind of a trial and error over the last couple years. So where do you start? So we can be successful at water treatment. We know plenty of folks, and then us ourselves and Faith and others have been doing water treatment for a while and have been successful about that. But I think the number one thing to start doing is to get to know your water source and identify kind of what you see as typical versus non-typical and how your water treatment reacts to those. If you're planning to treat your water, you really need to understand, how your system changes throughout your season. And potentially you have a different dose that you use at one part of the season than a different part of the season. And that really can be based on your environment, the temperature, potentially turbidity or other organic matter that might be in that source water. So I know Faith is going to go over some more about testing and validation and verification. And so I'll let her kind of continue on there. But we're happy to answer any additional questions related to ag water treatment. I know it's complex, and I know there's a lot going on, and sometimes it's scarier than not, but we do know folks who are doing it successfully, and we have hope that we'll get through and see that modification of that protocol.